Hi, my name is Caseen Gaines, and I am the author of Footnotes, the Black artist who rewrote the rules of the Great White Way. And if you'd like to learn more about Broadway in the 1920s and the hit show Shuffle Along, then listen to this conversation. I fell in love with theater really at an early age. I was kind of a ham as a kid. And so I always wanted to be a child actor. I never wanted to be an adult actor. I very specifically wanted to be a child actor because I just had the sense that I would peak at 9 years old, which I think might have been true. And so whether it was on screen, on stage, I just always loved the idea of performing and being able to tell stories by transforming yourself not only physically but vocally, mentally, and being able to embody someone else. I did theater all throughout elementary, middle school, high school. I once was a very awkward lead title character in The Who's Tommy, in a production of The Who's Tommy, not out of central casting, but it worked well enough. And but I really fell in love with Broadway specifically when I saw a production of Gypsy. And Gypsy, I think, is the best Broadway show ever written. That's my opinion. I'll take it to the grave, probably. And I went into the show completely cold. And at the end of the first act, I was just stunned. And I could not envision actually where the show would go in the second act. And the anticipation I felt for that 15-minute period between acts, I was hooked. I mean, I was hooked at that point, and just always wanted to be a part of the theater community. And so in 2005, actually, I co-founded a community theater company, which is still in existence. It's called Hackensack Theater Company in Hackensack, New Jersey. And we've done just great community shows. We've raised money for charity, and it's been great to be able to bring local theater and local actors to the stage telling these Broadway shows. So that's my theater story. I probably fell in love with directing while I was in high school, to be honest with you. I never really had the opportunity to direct, but I always was aware that I could always see the vision, and I am not the world's best singer. I'm not the world's best actor. I'm definitely not the world's best dancer, but I could see and envision the way things could best be told on stage. And so for me, once I had the opportunity to direct and actually find actors who were capable of executing a vision that I had, and find a set designer who was able to execute, and find a lighting designer and a choreographer and a musical director, to me, that's the greatest part of theater, to be honest with you, in my view, is just being able to sort of orchestrate everything, but also take the best talents of everyone and help drive them towards a shared goal and a shared vision. And that's something that I feel I do much better than performing and even writing for the stage. And so that's where I feel most comfortable and feel like I can make the best contribution to theater. The theater experience is so unique because every performance is different, and every performance is a time capsule of where everyone in that room is at that moment in their lives. And to me, there is something so electric, even if you think about someone in the audience sneezing, how that might impact the other audience members, how that might impact the performers on stage, that becomes kind of a part of that shared experience. And so a perfect example is the first time I saw Wicked. I saw it with Idina Menzel and Kristen Chenoweth, and Kristen Chenoweth had a horrible cold during this performance. It's the only time that I've seen her live on stage, and she had a horrible cold in Wicked. And Glinda was coughing and clearing her throat the entire show. And it became just a part of the show. It became kind of a part of the character. And in fact, there was even sort of an ad-libbed line about how she had been nursing this cold all the way from college dorm through the rest of her time in Oz. And so while I've seen Wicked since, that part of it is somewhere in the deep recesses of my mind is always kind of a part of that character for me. But that was just my one show. That was just the show that I happened to see. And so I love that about theater. I think that if you got the same group of the Rent film is a perfect example, right? It's not the entire full cast, but you take those actors and you have them tell a story in a different or the same story in a different medium, 15 years later or whatever it was, it's going to be a different product. And that's theater, but you get to see that 8 nights a week, a different show. And there's something so exciting about that. I've always been in love with storytelling. I think the love for writing came a little bit later, but I really fell in love with storytelling when I was in elementary school and I was introduced to The Twilight Zone, the classic series. And I still have my copy from like 30 years ago of Mark Scott Zakri's The Twilight Zone Companion, which is just a fantastic book. And I would watch these episodes, or in some cases read about these episodes, and then I would retell them to my friends during recess. I mean, I don't know if I was a great friend or if I was a horrible friend that I was torturing my friends with these stories, but there was something so exciting to me about having these really well-told stories, but filtered through me. They were going to be different than they were on screen and different than the way that they were written. And so that's really when I developed my love for storytelling. But my love for writing was probably, I don't know. I think as a kid, I always loved writing stories. I always loved, I think like most people, I thought that I would write fiction, maybe. I don't know if I was great at it, or true stories always seemed to be just as fascinating as made up stories, but they were a little bit easier to write because they'd actually happened. So I didn't have to sort of envision some great plot twists. But I started writing professionally in 2011. My first book came out. And it's just been amazing since then. I love being able to tell stories of these sort of hidden gems or forgotten gems, or in some cases, stories that you think you know really well, but I'm looking to put a different spin on it. And so that's something that I've been very fortunate to do for the last decade professionally. And I love doing it. So I really developed a love for historical storytelling, and particularly in terms of popular culture, when I learned about how they achieved the special effect in 1939 of the film going from sepia to Technicolor in The Wizard of Oz. And so I remember watching AMC or Turner Classic Movies or something like that. And they had someone sort of introduce the film and explain this sort of, trivia point. And when I heard how they did this is my favorite special effect in all of cinema. I'm going to spoil it. I'm going to share how it is. So when you see that shot, it's actually all in color. It looks like it's in black and white, but the set is painted sepia. Judy Garland has a body double who is in a sepia colored dress, sepia makeup. The entire shot is in color. And so the double opens the door, walks out of the frame, and Judy Garland walks into the frame in her blue gingham dress. And through the doorway, you see the Technicolor of Munchkinland. And when I learned about this, I said, that's amazing to know, but also a real person thought that up. I mean, The Wizard of Oz was a long time ago. And what other things did they try? How did they determine how to do this? Who made the decision to have a portion of the film in black and white and then a portion of the film in color. This film that everyone knew and everyone was familiar with, I certainly, as a kid, just sort of took for granted as this thing that just sort of materialized. But to sort of dig into who had come up with these different components that now had become part of the DNA of American and really global culture, I wanted to learn more about those people. And that was just a curiosity that I've always had. Again, I mentioned the Twilight Zone before. I didn't just want to watch the episodes. I wanted to know more about who Rod Serling was. And so I enjoyed biographies. I enjoyed behind the scenes stories, and was always sort of looking to insert people into these works of art where the art often overshadows the artist. So I became a popular culture historian because it seemed like the best way to describe what my mission was. I didn't feel, at the time, I didn't feel proper calling myself a biographer. I think that my new book, Footnotes, is a group biography, but I don't feel like my other books necessarily are biographies. So then I didn't really know what to call them. Are they cultural histories? But I also felt like popular culture is a term that is almost synonymous with being disposable or being sort of sugary and silly and unnecessary. And I wanted to sort of reclaim that there is history to all of these things that seem to be disposable. And so if you think about, for some reason, I'm thinking about like the Barbie doll, right? Like there are like histories and social histories and women's rights stories you can tell by just looking at the Barbie doll over decades. I felt like you could do that certainly with film and television and theater. And so my first book was a book about Pee-wee's Playhouse, which is, silly and loud and chaotic. And but I wanted to sort of approach it with a certain level of thoughtfulness. And I thought that popular culture historian would give it that. But it's funny because when I wrote my book on Back to the Future, We Don't Need Roads, I spoke with Huey Lewis, and Huey Lewis, I suppose, had my name and title on his itinerary. So when he called me for the interview, he said, "You're a popular culture historian?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Brother, if you're making a living as a popular culture historian, you are living the American dream." And so in a lot of ways, I do feel like I am living the American dream, and I'm very fortunate to be able to tell these stories. But popular culture historian seems to work for right now. When I tell a story about a television show, movie, theater show, I think the process is always different. I think it depends on what that show is. And I suppose it always starts with me trying to find out what is the story that I'm looking to tell about this particular work. I never want any of the books to be just, like a Wikipedia article of here are a bunch of fun facts about Back to the Future or A Christmas Story or The Dark Crystal or something like that. I really want there to be a story, and stories require there to be characters. So, for example, when I wrote an article on the making of the Howard the Duck film, the 1986 Howard the Duck film. And so to me, that story was very easy. That story was, there were all of these great players in Hollywood. You had Leah Thompson, who had just done Back to the Future. You had certainly George Lucas. You had all of these people that had come together to make what they felt was going to be a spectacular film. And it wasn't. And so how did all of these amazingly talented people come together to make this film that did not reflect their talents and their abilities? And that was sort of the guiding light of that particular article. For something like the Back to the Future book that I wrote, We Don't Need Roads, it was really more about these two people, Bob Gale and Bob Zemeckis, who were friends in college. They tried to make, or they made a number of films. They weren't terribly successful. They said, we're going to give it one more shot. And it ends up being Back to the Future. And Back to the Future is plagued with all of these problems in the beginning. And these two filmmakers were in no position to say, we're going to throw out the whole movie that we started making. We're going to go back to the drawing board and we're going to, fight to recast the main character. But they did that. And because they did that, the rest is sort of history. No pun intended with the future. And so, it's always a little bit different, but it requires me watching it a lot and really trying to think about what's the story that's most interesting to me, and just sort of trusting that if it's interesting to me, it'll be interesting to people reading it. I first learned about Shuffle Along when I went to see George C. Wolfe's 2016 sort of reimagining, is what I'm calling it, of Shuffle Along. So it was not just, it really wasn't the original show. It was sort of a making of, but when I went to go see it, it was actually the day before it closed. And I was lucky enough to be a participant in an audience, in a Q&A, a talk back with some of the stars of the show. And there was just this real funereal atmosphere at the Music Box Theater where the show was being staged. And it felt, I was amazed watching this show. And it felt like, the show closed prematurely. It only ran for 100 performances, the 2016 production. And I felt like there was this great injustice being done to the original show and the original creators yet again. And so I didn't know at that time that I was going to write a book. And in fact, this book, Footnotes, sort of grows out of me tinkering around with a couple of other projects. Like I wanted to write something about diversity on Broadway kind of more broadly. And then that sort of became focused to looking at that 2016 season, which was the season that gave us Hamilton and On Your Feet and Eclipse and Allegiance and Shuffle Along. Color Purple revival was that same season. So it was a pretty great year for diversity on Broadway. And ultimately, I just kept feeling compelled to tell the story of Shuffle Along because it just seemed like an amazing case study for what happened to Black artists routinely over the course of the last almost century at that point. Now it's a full century. So that was when I first learned about it. But I just started digging around and cannot believe now. I did not know that it would be a 440 something page book, when I was sitting there watching the show. But it ended up being because there was just such a rich story to tell about the artist behind this musical. I felt like I needed to tell the story of Noble Sissle, Eubie Blake, Flournoy Miller, and Aubrey Lyles because I loved theater. I am a Black man, like they were all Black men. And I did not know of this show's existence until 2016. And there was something about that reality that was really sad to me, actually. And Audra McDonald, who starred in that production as Lottie G, she had not heard of Shuffle Along until 2015 when she was asked to be in it. And so it felt like, musical theater, particularly, always felt to me like something that was very sort of exclusive. It felt like something that you had to be of a certain income level to really partake in it, to go see it. Certainly if you wanted to be on stage, my goodness, you had better have had dance lessons and vocal lessons, and all of those things take time and take money, and not everyone has access to all of those things. If you wanted to write a Broadway show, certainly that was going to be a challenge, because how are you ever going to get your words in front of a producer? What is going to make a producer take, your show over someone else's? And so I felt like when I thought about musical theater history and the musical theater canon and the Great American Songbook. Eubie Blake and Noble Sissle weren't there. Flournoy Miller and Aubrey Lyles weren't there, but they were there. They had been there. And so it was important to me as a writer to sort of say, if there's something I can do to help preserve the history of what took place in the 1920s in New York with Shuffle Along and these artists, I will do that, especially since that 2016 production did not have a cast album, is not available for licensing. Like the show, even though it was on stage just 5 years ago, that 2016 show has also sort of disappeared. And it was in the same year as Hamilton. So it was immediately overcast. It was nominated for 10 Tony Awards. And does anyone remember that? It was the same year as Hamilton. It lost every single Tony it was nominated for. So it felt like if I could do something to create a document, right, that can sort of be put in the time capsule of history, I felt a responsibility to do that. So creating Footnotes was interesting for me because it was the first time I had written a book where all of my main subjects were no longer living. Usually I had the opportunity to interview people and call them up and get their recollections and have them look through their files and their photographs and things like that. But I really had to do a lot of research for this in, I guess I'll say, the conventional sense. So I went to lots of libraries, certainly New York Public Library, the Schomburg Center in Harlem. I went to, at the time it was called the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore. That's where Eubie Blake has his archives. There are archives at Emory in Atlanta where Flournoy Miller has some of his archives. And so there was a lot of digging to reconstruct this story. Shuffle Along was a unique musical back then because while Blacks had been on Broadway before and there were all Black shows that had played on Broadway, there had been none that commanded Broadway pricing. So there had been none that had really been qualified as Broadway shows. It would be like, as Eubie Blake put it, I won't say it, Eubie Blake said, you can put a flea circus and have it play on the corner of Broadway and 42nd. That doesn't make it a Broadway show. That's not to say that the other Black Broadway shows were flea circuses, but Shuffle Along was definitely a Broadway show in the way that we think about it now, even though it played on 63rd Street, which is outside of the theater district. So it was amazing because it was the first time jazz music was heard in a Broadway theater. It brought a revolutionary kind of music, jazz, all Black cast, all Black orchestra, all Black creative team. It also was interesting because Noble Sissle and Eubie Blake were always very refined performers. Noble Sissle actually had a part in the show, but then later on at the end of the second act, he and Eubie Blake would get up on stage and they would perform some of their vaudeville act in full tuxedos, really being very, prim and proper and suave. Meanwhile, Miller and Lyles, the comedians who wrote the book, they actually were Black actors who wore blackface. And so you had sort of this interesting melange of a show that was kind of, the new Negro, Harlem Renaissance sort of style and sound, meeting this sort of stereotypical antebellum Black humor. And because of that, Black and white audiences found something to enjoy and Shuffle Along. The other thing that was really important and innovative about Shuffle Along was the use of women in the show. There were women characters who were able to actually be full-fledged people, not just caricatures. And also there was a dancing chorus that really danced. At the time, women choruses were really like Ziegfeld Follies, where the women were more ornamental. They would sort of parade around the stage in nice costumes. But in Shuffle Along, they really were revered for their dancing and celebrated for their dancing and their talent and not just their beauty. And so those are all a part of what made Shuffle Along so successful back in 1921. Footnotes starts actually on opening night of Shuffle Along in 1921 at the 63rd Street Music Hall. And Noble Sissle, Flournoy Miller, and Aubrey Lyles are all ready to hightail it out of the theater and run to Harlem because they had been warned that white audiences, Broadway audiences in particular, who had paid a pretty penny to get into the show, may not like a romantic subplot where a Black man and a Black woman are expressing love for each other through song. That's it. I mean, just that in 1921 was taboo. And it was taboo because women prior to Shuffle Along, for the most part, had been caricatures on stage. They had either been mammies or, sexually hungry Jezebels or these sort of, tragic mulatto figures or something like that. And, just to have a Black woman who was on stage wanting to be in a relationship with a Black man was a mind-blowing experience. And there were legitimate thoughts that there could be a race riot that breaks out at the sight of this, that white audiences would not tolerate it. And so ultimately that does not happen. The crowd does end up erupting, but they erupt and ask for an encore of this song. But it was important to me to sort of throw us directly into the action and also just make it clear that while, yes, this is a book about musical theater and there's singing and dancing and comedy at the center of it, there were also really high stakes. In this book, there's murder, there's death, there's a whole lot of things that are going on in the world at this time. And Shuffle Along existed in that ecosystem. You can't divorce it from that time period. But the main story arc really follows the four men at the center of the story, Miller and Lyles and Sissle and Blake, and it charts how each of those men met their theatrical partner, and then how those two partnerships met, and ultimately what the factors were that tore them apart. They all continued to make Broadway shows after Shuffle Along, but Shuffle Along was the only production that they all collaborated on together. And so there's something really interesting about that. But it's really a group biography about those four men and the other artists whose lives intersected with theirs. Shuffle Along is really at the center of the story, but it's at the center of the story. There's a whole lot of other story that surrounds it. What I want the audience to get out of Footnotes is that representation is important. Representation gives way to more representation. When you see yourself in a space, it makes it easier for you to envision yourself in that space as well. And one of the things that the men behind Shuffle Along really understood was that a way to actually achieve representation is to live in your authentic truth, is to tell the stories that you want to tell in the ways that you want to tell them. You can see that in a show like Hamilton now, where it's telling the story of the founding of America, but it's doing it in a way that resonates with contemporary audiences. Shuffle Along did not try to be the work of George or Ira Gershwin. It tried to be Shuffle Along. It tried to be this new and innovative thing. And that's why it worked. So it's a story of being true to yourself and succeeding, but it's also a story about systemic racism. It's a story about the factors that lead to a show like Shuffle Along being forgotten and lost in history. And so while there is triumph in this story, it's also a little bit of a cautionary tale. And I think when you read Footnotes, you'll realize that there are lots of people and factors to blame for the erasure of Shuffle Along. It's not just, white producers or something like that. There are lots of reasons. And that's the way progress works sometimes. Sometimes, it's messy and it's, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or vice versa. But, the story of Footnotes is sort of a complicated story. I don't know. Someone asked me the other day, is it optimistic? Is it pessimistic? And I don't really know if it's either. And I don't really know if it has to be. I think life is complicated. This is a complicated story because it's about 4 people's lives. And they just happen to work on this one show together. But there is value and importance in remembering who they were and this amazing show that they contributed to theater history. More voices should be heard in the theater world because more voices should be heard in every space. And if theater is about storytelling, there is something that everyone can learn by listening to the stories of people who are different than them. And I think that's really important. As a kid growing up, I remember being incredibly impacted by reading Elie Wiesel's Night. I'm not Jewish, but I had such a understanding and reverence for the Holocaust and understood what that meant because that story was a story that I was introduced to. I think a lot of people learn about race, whether it's through a story like To Kill a Mockingbird or something like that. But you can't say something like Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun or the work of August Wilson, while they are inherently, Black stories, those are stories that resonate with everyone, just like Death of a Salesman is a white story, right? I mean, it's a story about like middle America, but it's a story that I think everyone can take something from. And so, we become better as a people when we develop empathy and understanding, and realize that while we all have different realities or different lives, I should say, different existences, there are great commonalities between us. And it's also okay when there aren't things that we have in common. There's value in just saying, I see that you have a different experience and I want to know more about that so that I can understand that. So yeah, I think that what Lin-Manuel Miranda has done with Hamilton in telling this American story through hip hop, R&B, rap, traditional musical theater as well, I think is just brilliant. And I would like to see more shows that frankly aren't just all Black shows or all Latinx shows or all shows with people of color, but just more shows that have truly diverse casts, in terms of, people in leading roles of different diversities, not just, white lead characters and brown faces in the ensemble. It would be nice if theater looked a little bit more like New York when you open up the door and walk outside of the theater. People should read Footnotes because it's an American story. It's a great story if you love theater. It's a great story if you love history, but it's just sort of a great story about overcoming the odds, overcoming adversity, living in your authentic truth, succeeding, and then what one has to do to hold on to success. And there are interpersonal factors, there are business factors, there are societal factors, there's fame, there's drama. And, we've seen stories like this told in different facets, but I don't know if I've ever read a story where it has been a story about theater, where Black people have been at the center of that story in the 1920s. And just to set the scene for you a little bit, the 1920s was an amazingly challenging time for New York. It was the Prohibition era. It was the very beginning of Prohibition. And one of the things that I discovered while I was writing the book was New York State actually had derived 75% of its total revenue from the legal sale of alcohol before Prohibition. I mean, 75%, that's nuts. That's a statewide figure. And so when Prohibition set in, it completely decimated New York. This is right after World War I. This is right after the greatest period of racialized violence in the United States since the Civil War. The Tulsa Massacre, which you may be familiar with, was 1 week after Shuffle Along's debut on Broadway. And so in this landscape, these Black artists were able to succeed in a country that was quite literally, one could argue, designed to trap them in failure. But they didn't fail. And yet, even once they succeeded, they had trouble holding on to that. And so, I'm a firm believer that a lot of the issues in this country and in this world could be resolved if we just were honest about our history. I think that we might have a more inclusive Broadway today if we remembered that there were all Black musicals on Broadway before The Wiz in 1975 or something like that, So it's important for that. And I think it's important to also share this story because it's a story that everyone can connect with in the same way that when I went to go see Hidden Figures, for example, I didn't know anything about the space race, besides what I knew from school. I didn't really care about NASA. I hadn't given it any thought in a long time, but there's just something about that story that connects with you because we've all had that feeling of not knowing if we could do something. And if we are lucky, we've had the experience of being the first to do something, right? But that takes courage and perseverance. And then once you're the first, how do you hold on to that? So I think Footnotes is something that you'll really enjoy, and I hope you check out and keep on your shelf. And then when people say, "What's that?" talk it up to them. I think the 2016 Shuffle Along was really important in reintroducing people like me, frankly, to this amazing bit of theater history. And, I think George C. Wolfe did it yet again with, his Ma Rainey film. That was an August Wilson show or August Wilson play. But, Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, which was just on Netflix, once again is bringing this historical figure to the masses. I think there's such value in the telling of the story of what transpired back in 1921, whether that is on stage, whether that's in book form, whether that is in a film. I mean, I would love to see this story told on screen in some way. But I just think there's such value in it because while I was writing, I could not stop thinking about all of the people who are in theater programs who want to see themselves on stage. And while part of me thought about all of the Black and brown kids or artists who want to be on a Broadway stage and they're taking dance lessons and vocal lessons and they're in school, I also thought about what value there also is for all of the white performers in that same position to know that this show existed as well. Because learning about women's history isn't just for women, it's also for men. Learning about Black history isn't just for Black people, it's about all people, because there's value in that. And so I think the 2016 Shuffle Along was really important in reminding people that this show existed. And I think that Footnotes, having the opportunity to do a deeper dive into the lives of each of these performers will hopefully go even deeper into letting people know what was so incredibly significant about these performers in this moment in time. I would love to see Footnotes as a movie or a TV series. I think that there's, um, you know, when you write a book, you have sort of you have to sort of decide what makes it in and what makes it out. And I just there's so much biographical information about Noble Sissle, Eubie Blake, Flournoy Miller, and Aubrey Lyles in the book. But while I was writing it, I was seeing it very cinematically. I could see the different locations where they were playing. I could see the disputes that they got into, the trysts that they had, the venues that they played, the dressing rooms that were too small, and yeah, I think it would be great to see it on screen. How do we make that happen? Let's write our congressman. Is that the way it works? No, we'll figure out some way, but I think we can make it happen. I loved working with the team at Sourcebooks on Footnotes. And I think I loved it first and foremost because they are an independent publisher. And there is something about Shuffle Along, which was a kind of a renegade, a renegade show that, I love that the Sourcebook story is someone who said, I'm going to start a publishing company literally in my home. And that's what she did, I believe, back in the 1980s. And now they are, I believe, the largest independent publisher in the United States. And they have been so incredibly supportive and understanding of the story that I've wanted to tell, and really understood why this story needed to be told in this way. And so it's important that when there are publishers that are uplifting stories that you value, that you actually go out and support and buy those books. And I'm not saying it because I get a benefit, but I'm saying the publishing industry is a business, and so when they get a proposal for something like Footnotes and they're trying to decide, are we going to take the risk on this book? The answer should always be yes. And what helps them get to yes is being able to say, you know what, last time we published a book like that, it did really well. And so it's important that you do go out and just support people that are telling the kinds of stories that you appreciate. That's what I love. And I love also let them know that. And what I mean is tweet at them, post on social media, share the books that you love, whether it's Footnotes or any other book. Share the books that you love, tweet at the publishers, tell them that you're really excited about it, tell them that you've recommended it to 20 of your friends, because it's important for them to know that too. We are always so aware of our readers, and we write the books really for you, but don't always get to hear back from you as to whether or not you enjoyed the book. So I can't tell you as an author, there's nothing I love more than getting an email from someone who said, really liked your book. Thank you for writing it. And, do that. Recommend books, tell stories, always share stories. That's the most important thing. I miss Broadway. I miss theater. I miss being in a theater. I miss, I wrote this book primarily while we were quarantined. Now, when I say I wrote it, I mean, I had researched for years. I had so many pages of notes. I have still kind of notes living on my desk around me that you can't see right now, but believe me, my desk is a little bit scary. But so I had all of these pieces together, but I really started writing in a really focused way in probably like February or March. And so the book was really written kind of from start to finish between February and September or so. And while I was writing, I just kept wanting to go to New York. I live in New Jersey. I live about 12 miles outside of Manhattan. And so being unable to go to New York, unable to see a show, unable to walk around, it was great for my writing, I suppose. I was able to focus and not be distracted, I guess. But it just made me remember how important theater is, and what a sense of community you feel even when you're among strangers watching a show, but you're all there at the same time for that common purpose. And so if you are looking for a fix, if you need to sort of live in the space of theater for some period of time, I think Footnotes will provide that for you. It certainly did for me over this period of the pandemic, and I think it will for you as well. My name is Caseen Gaines, and if you want to learn more about my book, Footnotes, The Black Artist Who Rewrote the Rules of the Great White Way, you can find it at any book retailer, and you can find more information about it at my website, CaseenGaines.com. That's CaseenGaines.com. Find me on social media at Caseen Gaines and let me know how you like the book. And I'll see you at the theater.